Dobry Tiborovsky. We'll start off this morning with a shot of kvass. Different brand this time. Kvass Taras from Ukraine, with instructions in Russian, Ukrainian, Belarusian, Romanian, Georgian, and Armenian on how to drink it. The bottom line is, don't drink it warm, always serve it chilled. But anyway, the 150th anniversary of the American Civil War is upon us, and unlike the centenary, which was focused almost exclusively on the military side and was heavily pro-Confederate, now there's a much greater emphasis on the very inseparable economic, ethical, social, and political aspects of the American Civil War, and that's as it should be. During the centenary of 1961, the U.S. was still in denial of those things, as it was of the need for the civil rights movement inspired by that centenary. So in this month's issue of The Nation, in keeping with the sesquicentennial, there's a piece on the legacy of slavery by the progressive historian Eric Foner. Professor Foner wants to remind us that for all the revisionism out there, the ending of slavery was a right and good thing in itself and worth fighting for regardless of other motives. Now, I'm not disputing the ethical dimension of his premise, but as political economy is inseparable from this issue, I thought I'd add my own 2 shekels to this. All of which might seem like a cut-and-dried issue of history, but not in the US&A. Like Hitler and the Holocaust, it doesn't go away, but it lingers at the margins of consciousness even when it's consciously avoided. Was slavery the cause of the American Civil War, and abolishing it the reason for fighting said war? Well, slavery, like states' rights, was a front issue. No one fights and dies for tariffs, or congressional parity, or protecting interstate commerce, or a rich man's labor supply. One needs emotive issues that will fire the idealism of youth and the moral indignation of their elders, all couched in the rhetoric of liberty, setting men free or declaring sovereign independence from tyranny, or making the world safe for democracy in order to get men to put on uniforms and take up weapons and put their lives on the line. And conscription always helps. But surely we know by now that governments and those private powers leading governments by the nose don't push for war from the goodness of their hearts, but for very concrete reasons of power and gain. So what was to be gained by going to war in this case? Contrary to popular history, there was no solid North when it came to the South or slavery. Anti-slavery in much of the North meant anti-black. Keeping out the one kept the other out also. Just as Southerners supported slavery as the backbone of white supremacy, whether they owned slaves or not, and took up arms to fight for white power, so racism was at the corner of the ideological argument over slavery as well as ideals of human freedom. But I contend that such emotive issues are not what moves the calculating brain of war makers. And when we say slavery was or was not the cause of anything, let's define what exactly we're talking about. If by anti-slavery is meant humanitarian concern about the slave, this can be dismissed as convenient sentimentality for most. But if we mean by slavery as the economic, social, and political system affecting the entire market economy of the U.S., and the balance of power in government, as well as the basis of social hierarchy, and that is the basis of the anti-slavery movement, then we're getting to the heart of things. For the slave-owning planters, especially in cotton production, the bottom line for secession was in repudiating the debts they owed to northern bankers, especially in New York. The New York merchants wanted Congress to bend over backwards, finding an accommodation with the South to avoid secession, but the Southern fire-eaters, the rabid secessionists, wanted none of it. They had a very concrete plan at the back of their heads. Their system was run on deficit, pretty much like the modern U.S. economy, and if they couldn't spread their system, it would collapse and default in bankruptcy, so better to secede from the U.S., because as a sovereign power they could stiff their creditors, the New York bankers, and negotiate new loans with England, as well as get more favorable terms of trade from the English textile industry, as opposed to the New England mill owners. Massachusetts was the center of American textile production in its cotton mills, and also the center of American abolitionism. This was no coincidence. Introducing a free labor system in the American South would tie cotton producers, the planter class, to the national market economy on the manufacturer's terms. The cost of slaves, which were lifetime investment purchases, were factored into the cost of raw materials, and cheaper labor would mean cheaper cotton prices. Now, you might think there's nothing cheaper than slave labor. But chattel slaves were the equivalent of human livestock, commodities in their own right. The price of slaves was rising through the roof in the 1850s, like the sticker price on 2012 Durangos. so that the average purchaser could not afford one without running heavy lines of credit. If you had a stock of slaves already, you could even make as much, if not more, profit selling the offspring as making a crop with them. Labor was becoming the expensive monopoly of a restricted master class, and this cost was being passed on to the industrial processor of the raw commodity and to the consumer. Like low tariffs, slavery was an economic burden to the profit of the textile manufacturer, and textiles were the backbone of American industry at the time. Mining and steel production were still at their founding stages. So the parity established in Congress between one producing system and the other was all well and fine when both sides were farmer societies. This was no longer the case when manufacturing and interstate commerce were growing exponentially and demanding the shackles be thrown off of themselves. As Frederick Douglass, the black abolitionist, said, every man believes in freedom for himself. That's why the real beneficiary of the Emancipation Proclamation turned out to be not the former black slave, but the corporation, given perpetual legal personhood. And as you may know, after the Civil War, Northern industry quickly moved south to build railroads, cotton mills, and to extract land resources like coal and timber. It wanted to do this before the war, too, but the South slave system made the cost of free labor too expensive for Northern capitalists, with hungry eyes turned south. Leasing slaves is as much a liability as leasing any other equipment, and slaveholders were quite demanding when this was tried. So better to get rid of this obstacle altogether. And no sooner was the slave system abolished than Northern venture capitalists swooped down to begin those very industries. A little side note is that the free coal miners of East Tennessee arose in armed revolt against mine owners who employed convict lease labor. Unlike the slaves, the convicts really did amount to free labor, competing directly with and underbidding the free worker for whom slavery had allegedly been abolished. Just as big U.S. manufacturers ranted and raved about freeing the world from communism in the Cold War, so they railed against the slave power a century earlier and for the same pecuniary motives. Behind the rhetoric of liberation was the desire to beef up the hard production of a war economy. Without doubt, the Civil War forged the U.S. steel and mining industries on a national level, as the Cold War would on a global scale. So the face of Simon Legree, like Hitler or Stalin or Saddam Hussein, was a symbol of evil, as he whips and tortures the slave cringing under his brutality. But these were also useful propaganda tools of production and profit. The evil of others is always a convenient shelter for the less than noble motives of a great crusading hero. And after the great crusade for freedom, after the dust is settled and the blood is dried, we find the American freedman had served his purpose, and so he was, of course, forgotten, left behind to stew in his own shit, just like the captive nations after communism or the Iraqi people after Saddam, while the carpetbaggers reaped the fruits of freedom and invested them in mutual funds and derivatives. To knock upon the phone. See who this is. Hello? John Brown? Still moldering in the grave, huh? At least they gave you a fiber optic line. You want our viewers to remember what you said on the way to the gallows? That had you so interfered in behalf of the rich, the powerful, the intelligent, the so-called great, or any of that class, it would have been all right. And every man in the courtroom judging you would have deemed it an act worthy of reward rather than punishment. That you are still quite certain that the crimes of this guilty land will never be purged away but with blood. Well, I hear you. But, talk like that is still only for history books and the statues in Kansas City. There's a Patriot Act passed since then to protect freedom from people who take it too seriously, like you. Oh, they wouldn't hang you in public now. We're too progressive and humane for that. Just ship you off to Guantanamo for waterboarding and electric shock treatment over a barrel, or dogs nibbling at your testicles, or shoving your head up the buttocks of fellow unlawful combatants. Just keeping up the tradition of making men free while you molder on in that grave.